Hey there, and welcome to YAS, a stripper podcast. On this podcast, we'll discuss how classifying each other as people and workers is dangerous to society and marginalized groups of people. We'll also talk about the climate in and outside of the strip clubs and all of the amazing things that strippers do. And of course, we'll talk about all of the things in between. I'm your queen, A.M. Davies, and this is YAS, a stripper podcast.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here today. This is a very special and important episode we have a few guests here with us today. And we're just going to jump right into it and introduce our guests one by one. And Misha, we're going to start with you. Hello. Hi.
Hi, super happy to be here. My name is Misha. My pronouns are she, her, and I was a student at S Factor for about 5 years. For 6 months of that, I was actually a front desk worker, front desk ambassador, and I went through teacher training kind of like halfway through that, and then ended up being like teaching for 6 months at the tail end of my total time there.
Gotcha. Thank you. Next, we have Alyssa. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for putting this together. I'm Alyssa Aparicio and my pronouns are she, her. And I was involved in the class. I was a student in the class that was filmed for the documentary that came out on Netflix. And yeah, I was in that class for about 4 months. I was also a stripper at the time. I'm still a stripper on and off. And yeah, that's kind of where I come into the conversation.
Lovely. Thank you. That's all right.
Hi, I'm Jess. I was a student at S Factor for about 6 months when I decided to enter teacher training. And once I finished that, which probably took me about another 6 months when I did it, you could spread it out. I was a teacher there for 13 years, from about 2007 to when everything imploded last year in June of 2020. I was in 2 different stretches. I was one of the teacher trainers there, and I was not a part of the filming of the Netflix class for Strip Down, Rise Up, but I was coincidentally teaching in the second studio space across the lobby. So I was actually present for a lot of the external goings on around the film.
Gotcha. So all 3 of you have incredible insight on almost like the rise and fall of everything that's been happening. And so we have so many talking points today, and thank you so much for sharing with me your experiences so that we can share with this audience. And I just want to kind of get right into it. The first thing on the list that I made for us is the culture of S Factor, which is sort of like the birth of all of these issues, right? Because once you create the culture, then everything sort of like falls under that culture and then continues to perpetuate itself. So I really wanted to examine the culture at S Factor, which then was created by Sheila Kelly, which then led into the movie Strip Down, Rise Up. So Misha, we're going to start with you. And we have racism issues here, a non-apology to important figures in this story. And so I'm just going to kind of let you take it away and speak on those things.
Yeah, oh man, where do we even begin with that? I would say like grounding kind of like my experiences and my desire to speak out about this is the idea that you didn't have to be proximal to Sheila Kelly to be hurt by the culture. You didn't have to be there a long time either to be hurt by the intensity of the toxicity of the culture. I was there for 5 years on and off. I was there as an ambassador for 6 months. I only taught for 6 months, like right at the end until everything imploded, as Jess said. And in those experiences, like as people started coming forward, I was realizing like, oh, the things that I've been noticing in the short time that I've been there compared to like many people like Jess, who just had like over a decade's worth of experience there. There are things that had already been brought up things about like things of anti-Blackness, classism, really crossing people's boundaries, even when it came to like their own bodies, which was also just disturbing to think of in a place that's touting themselves as like a safe place to like reclaim your femininity, you know, reconnect with your body, things like that. And so one of the, I think a way in which that stuff, I feel like it was there very intensely. A way in which it became public was when a teacher, and Jess, please feel free to hop in and add in any caveats, because I feel like even I get kind of hazy just like reminiscing on this, and like from a very like body activated place. I remember this happening, and I remember like not knowing a whole lot about it. This was kind of, it happened during a time where I was kind of like in like an off period in my on and offness as a student. I remember Rhonda Harrelson, who also was a longtime teacher there, a Black woman, posted something on her personal account, you know, and nothing to do with S Factor. I think it was criticizing, like, you know, some like an article about how it was criticizing Coachella for appropriation of indigenous, like tribal, like indigenous garb, indigenous, like, yeah, indigenous garb. But
white girls that like to wear headdresses at Coachella,
exactly, you know, and that was something she posted on her own personal account. There were a lot of people who then like, a lot of longtime S Factor like participants who were paying the tens of thousands of dollars to go to retreats, who came in and personally attacked her. And it wasn't just like, oh, I disagree with this. There was name calling. There was, they were trying to,
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're a shit teacher. You are always a shit teacher. You're jealous because you can't afford a backstage pass like we could. And keep in mind, Rhonda didn't tag anybody in this. She didn't at anybody in this. So somebody who was friends with these people presumably saw it, and then they came to attack her. And the thing that was most disappointing about it to me was I brought this up in the town hall call we had in June of 2020. And Sheila acted like she barely heard of these, particularly two people. One was a former teacher from the Orange County studio. One was what they call a house girl, which is somebody that like used to take classes like way back in the day before there was a studio. And I heard a rumor, unsubstantiated, but I heard a rumor that Sheila was actually at Coachella that year with those two fucking people. So tell me you don't know them. And when Sheila was called to defend Rhonda, her employee at the time, not for much longer at that point, she basically did an I don't know her.
Yeah, and even there were people who were specifically trying to call in what they can only understand and perceive as like, you know, her boss. They were like, I'm gonna essentially tell on you to your boss about this. People were, you know, and so that's, I think, another really disturbing thing, that, you know, there were people who take class. They were, you know, it wasn't being addressed, because, you know, they are people who spend a lot of money there, all over like a social media post that had nothing to do with S Factor, nothing to do with them. And I feel like the reason we bring this up, I feel like at least in the time that I was there, I don't have a lot of previous knowledge about like just incidences before like the 5 years that I was there. But this, you know, Rhonda left shortly after that. And I think, you know, we mentioned this story because Rhonda has been someone who has been there consistently calling people in about this. And I don't necessarily, like, that's as far as kind of like, I'm willing to talk. I don't necessarily want to speak for Rhonda, but sure. I know that it's because of her that I even had visibility as early as I did about stuff that was going on, stuff that was outside of retreats, which, you know, to this day, I had never been to or had been invited to, as like a teacher and a student there, an ambassador there. So yeah, I think it's just Rhonda deserves so much credit for bringing a visibility to this in the first place. And then later down kind of in the line of events, hosting a community call to, I want to say years later, a few years later, hosting a community call after, having quit from this to address those things.
Right. So she wasn't even there anymore. And she's like, I care about these people who are being harmed because I understand the culture. And so I want to have this call to bring this to your attention, basically, is what Rhonda did. Right. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. And I want to be really careful to not tell anybody else's story, but this is all
Sure.
extremely public. This all played out on Facebook, on the S Factor pages.
Yeah.
Which are now archived. But if you know anything about the internet, that doesn't mean they're not available. So in, I think, spring of 2020, when George Floyd was very publicly murdered, and every company started coming out of the woodwork, posting Black squares and saying, we stand with Black lives. S Factor did a similar corporate speak post. And Rhonda commented, she was one of the first people apparently that commented, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, saying, what does this statement actually mean if you're not going to address the racism in your company from Sheila on down? Things I brought up 3 years ago that you've still done nothing to address. We don't need you to be white saviors. We need you to show up. And S Factor's statement of standing here in solidarity with the Black community, one of their first acts of solidarity with the Black community was to delete her comment and block her account. And because that's how the internet works, it didn't disappear. And so Rhonda took that comment to her page and reposted, and it completely blew up from there. And that is what prompted the all hands on deck call of early June last year.
June 2020.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it was within the first week of June. I think it was June 6th. Yeah.
So there's just been an ongoing issue of racism from the very beginning, and it's not being properly addressed in today's.
Well, apparently, they created this, I'm forgetting now what they called it, but it was essentially a diversity and inclusion committee in the company. It was originally 4 people. There was 1 Black woman. I know of 2 of the women were LGBT community members. I'm just blanking on who the 4th was. It was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, that this all started to come to a head, and they did this as people were really hoping, they would get out in front of issues that were coming up more and more, especially on social media. And instead, what that committee ended up doing, what one of the members very publicly stated in her letter of resignation, was after they went through the training manual to correct problematic language that was in there, rather than seeing anything in advance that the company was putting out, they were basically used as a cleanup crew. So the company would put something out that hadn't been vetted, shit would rain down on them, and then these 4 women would be called in to essentially clean up the mess. And so when Rhonda's post was taken down, they didn't run it by this committee. Apparently, they didn't even ask anybody on that call in June 2020. At the time, the GM of the company admitted that she just freaked out and took it down. So there was no vetting. It was just like, eek, someone is criticizing the brand, and Sheila directly get it down.
Right.
Yay,
Yeah.
accountability.
Because there's a level of protection of the image, basically.
In my 13 years at the company, I never once heard Sheila Kelly admit to personally being the reason something was done wrong, or the reason something went wrong, or that she did anything wrong.
Gotcha.
That is my personal experience.
Gotcha. Thank you for all of that. And I'm sure we're going to come back to this topic, because how can we not, with all of the things that we have to talk about? But continuing on the topic of culture and how it's been developed at S Factor, something that's come to my attention is that when you're going to a class for the first time, or the class culture is to talk about the story of Sheila and how she basically needed to play a stripper in a movie. God, my mind is racing. I have so many things I want to say about that. So I'm going to stay on topic here. How she, played a stripper in a movie and then fell in love with the movement. And you know, I have on record something that she said to the effect of, I wanted to bring this light out of, or this movement out of the darkness and into the light. And yeah, and so, you know, I'd like to discuss, and Misha, I'm going to start with you because you have a specific point of strippers crawling on the floor to pick up their money, and how, you know, what that type of culture has created. And then Alyssa, we're going to come to you after that, so you can really fill us in further on what the stripper culture conversations have been like.
Yeah, so even as early back as when I was there, in my first intro, like that I took ever as a student, someone who had never been to the studio before, they did have this origin story of like, Sheila was, you know, enamored with this movement, and she was like, oh wow, like this is so great. And then she would describe like, oh yeah, like the curve and the fluidity of a woman's body, and I was so enamored. And then at the end, when the strippers would like crawl on the ground and pick up their money, like she touted it as this thing that was so sad, you know, like, oh, it's so demeaning, like, oh, it somehow invalidates, like, you know, any elegance, majesty, fun, like it was somehow like so demeaning to then have to like bookend this beautiful movement by like crawling around and picking up your money on the floor. And so this was part of every intro, because as a student, I went back to intros. As a front desk ambassador, I sat in on like dozens of intros. And as a teacher, this was like part of the origin story that you were taught to teach in your intros. I mean, obviously, because it was getting heard everywhere. This is like a main component of what was getting taught in every intro class at the studio. And so I feel like that putting them on the opposite end of the spectrum of like stripping and pole dance, like stripping and pole dance, like there's always been that that condescension and like perpetrating of that stigma, like from the get-go, from the origin story in, you know. And so that's definitely something that really stuck out from my memories there to like now what they're trying to like backtrack and say. Like, I feel like it was very much, you know, like not a stripper from the get-go. And Jess, I don't know if you have more to say to that, because, you know, like I was saying, like I feel like being here as someone who was like involved recently, what I want to do most is like all of the stuff that teachers who have been there for a long time, I experienced it as recently as this, you know, like it's still happening. The pattern is still there.
Yeah, that was definitely part of the origin story that I heard way back in 2006. Personally, that was not a detail I included in my retelling of the origin story, because I always tended to lean more into my comfort zone is to make jokes. So I always tried to lean into what was so funny about it. This nice Irish Catholic girl, ha, 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 which is definitely something that came from the story I was told from Sheila. But that the difference between S Factor and stripping was canon as far as what was taught. You know, I even makes me a little grossed out now, but when I was first teaching, I remember saying to my mom, my parents were very conservative, oh, we're respectable, we've been on Oprah, like as a way of separating, right? There was this, it wasn't even a dotted line, there was this bright fluorescent line. I know of people who way back in the day, if they got caught dancing, would just get fired. Yeah, there was always a bright line. Yeah, you could get fired for teaching somewhere else, which I'm pretty sure is a labor law violation. And you could absolutely get fired for stripping, or for performing in any capacity if you didn't run it through the studio. I remember that happening as well. So like, I'm an actress. I got cast in like 5 or 6 TV shows as a stripper when I was working at S Factor. You know, I used to joke to my dad, I'm like, it's network, they can't make me take my clothes off. Yeah, they would absolutely, there was just a absolute bright line. But so there was so much whorephobia, stripper phobia.
Yeah.
That's not what we are,
Right.
even though that's the origin story that Sheila thought was so beautiful.
Right.
I'm gonna shut up now because I feel like Alyssa has
Yeah, I'm excited to hear from Melissa on this because you are a stripper and
Yeah. So to start with the origin story, I just like, it's so interesting, blatantly obvious to me now how Columbus discovered America it is. It's like, oh, I took it upon myself to cleanse this art that's been around for ages, predominantly with BIPOC individuals, particularly women, and well, not only women, but many genders, but particularly women, right? BIPOC women. And yeah, I just, coming into the space as a stripper, I don't even know why or how they let me in, really, now that I think about it, because my application, I was very clear, like, I do this work professionally and I'm curious about this space and what, as somebody who's interested in empowerment and sexuality and sexual freedom, it just seemed like an interesting overlap that I wanted to explore. But I just remember feeling this really just icky feeling, like I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but I just didn't feel welcome. I felt like the space had been vanillified, and that me coming into it, somehow I felt like I was not in alignment. And then it was subtle at the beginning, but I think the biggest red flag moment, because for me it's like basically a sin to tell me to put more clothes on, but I came in an outfit that I wore that had just come from Vegas working, and I came like literally straight to the class, and I pulled something out of my bag that I would wear in the club, and it was sheer. And I remember them saying no sheer materials, but I was like, oh really, fuck that. So I wore it to class, and was pulled aside after and said, reminder, no sheer material. And I'm just like, to me, that was the biggest, like the most immediate moment. That might have been like the second or third class where I was just like, oh, okay, so I'm not welcome as the the stripper side of me isn't welcome. My body isn't actually welcome. And you can see it in like the way that the attire, I mean, Sheila is always in a tank top and leggings, and it's a very clear statement. Like even when she showed up when she shows up in the public, when she shows up in class, it's always like this uniform. And I feel like it's a way of her saying, I am just like you. I'm like a respectable woman who always keeps my clothes on, and I could feel that tension, even though it wasn't necessarily addressed. And that was part of the thing. Like stripping was never necessarily addressed other than the aesthetic. So like there was a whole big deal made out of like, oh, let's go get stripper heels, like let's go to Hollywood. And they planned out this whole big trip where they went to Hollywood. And if you see the movie, it's one of the most appalling scenes in the movie, where all of the women from the class go to buy shoes, and they make like a big deal. And it's the only time in the movie where there's like hip hop playing. And it's such a offensive moment, because you're just like, oh my God, the giant raging elephant in the room is that like this is all about whitewashing the experience, and it's like trying on and getting to play a role that you actually want to make sure is defined as separate. And so I didn't really necessarily have the words. I didn't know anybody in the company. I didn't really have a confidant in the space like I do now after speaking out about my experience when the film came out. I connected with Misha and Jess and many other people who also just confirmed and affirmed all of these feelings that I was having. That was basically like I was gaslighting myself, thinking, okay, maybe, maybe I'm just imagining things. I don't know. I was having all of this, internal confusion. But it's also extremely clear now. Yeah. I don't know, I went off there. So if there's a
No, that was
specific
great.
question.
No,
Or
it's just, your thoughts on the culture and what your experience was as a stripper. And I think, that it's whatever comes to you, you know. And the thing where you're like, oh, I think I gaslit myself. When I was watching that movie, I felt gaslit as fuck the entire time I was
Mm.
watching that movie.
And
Like,
if you
not,
had the thought about, you wondered why they accepted you into the class, if you were clear about it on your expectation, it's because your credit card didn't decline. In my experience, allegedly, that's my experience.
there was a moment in class when we were going around and sharing at the beginning, and I had shared about a recent performance that I had done. And I remember Sheila just being like, wait a second. She had this look across her face like, wait, what? She was like, did you say performance? I was like, yeah, I'm a performer. This is like the first thing I told you about myself. So it was strange that, yeah, it was strange. It's like, well, yeah, they didn't know who they had let into the room. and now, I mean, I won't shut up about it because it's like so appalling what what was going on there that hadn't been exposed or hadn't been addressed until it was very blatant in the film how toxic and how toxic and
yeah,
awful really it all was.
I don't have any
yeah.
insight into how they chose the people to focus on in the film, in terms of like, there was obviously there's more people in the class than you could do justice to in an hour and a half, 2-hour movie. So I know they focused in on certain people, but I would be extraordinarily surprised to hear that Sheila didn't put her thumb on the scale and who they chose to focus on in relation to the people that had the most trauma to resolve. And the fact that that's not why you were there is probably, in my best guess, why you only see you in the background in a couple of shots.
Mm.
It's not the
No.
story she was looking to tell. It's not the story she's looking to tell about her company. I was told as a baby teacher, because the question would come up, like, are any of your students really strippers? And I was told, oh no, we really like to go inside, and strippers are all about the external. They don't like to connect to their internal feelings.
Dude, that's infuriating as fuck, man.
Yeah. And
That's like, okay.
yeah, like I said, that was just canon.
It's so gross. I feel like every time I gather with people to talk about something, I hear some new bullshit. Like every single time, even since last year, no matter who I talk to, some new bullshit always comes out. And it's like, it's not surprising, but it's also just it's so gross. And it's so
There's validating. The article that was news to me, and I was there for 13 fucking years.
Yeah. So it's, it's validating against all of the times that I know I gaslit myself a lot in my time there. And so it is like, it's not surprising, but like, oh wow. Like,
Well, it's just, we're an entire group of people with feelings and thoughts and ideas and self-care, and and to label an entire group of people like that is just, it's very harmful. Actually, it's very, very damaging, because then it creates this culture and idea of we are less than, and therefore who gives a fuck about them and what they're doing. And that kind of leads me into, there's a whole other isms that I saw in that movie, or phobias: whorephobia, fat phobia, homophobia, transphobia, all of those things. And like, was that also like the culture? Because that was in the movie, right? I've been to one class like in 2006 or something. So I don't have enough experience, but is that a culture that existed within the class setting and the organization or company as well? All those phobias?
I can say from, again, not telling anyone else's story, but one of the people who was of the LGBTQ community who was on that 4-person like diversity committee, in her words, the language of S Factor was so heteronormative as to basically be homophobic. Everything was presented as, you are obviously doing this for your imaginary man. Everything was put that way. There was one moment when they used to still have merch in the lobby where they sold this shirt for Mother's Day that had this whole thing on the back about like your daily to-do list. And it was all about like, drop kids to school, go to S Factor. And at the time I was like, what about the childless and the barren? Like, hello. It was just all ultra heteronormative and basically in the mold of Sheila. She's a mom, she's heterosexual. So that must be what everyone wants, in my opinion, allegedly.
Yeah, do either Misha or Alyssa have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so the experience I have with this, the one I'm going to talk about is actually back when I was very first started at S Factor, was super excited about the movement. And my sibling, who is non-binary, like I knew at the time, like it's interesting because like it was always like, oh, no men allowed in the studio unless unless you're like facilitating a private dance for like somebody, and at the time people were allowed to like use the studios if they were empty. And I think at this point I actually had paid for time in the studio for just like, like I was super excited to like share the movement with my sibling. And so we were just going to book some time to like play. And I had gotten approval from like my supervisor, but when we showed up, the studio director immediately was like, oh no, this is not allowed. Like, and I mean, at this time, like, I was also like, like poor early 20s. Like I like paid for like an Uber to get there. And then like, it was like, okay, well, I guess I'm Ubering back, home. And like, it was, but it was definitely a very visceral, like, what the fuck are you doing type of energy, that this like, this like, and this is from a studio director who was not there. That's another thing. The studio director position was like a big ass revolving door. So like just the lack of consistency in leadership in the studio was also like a point of like, it felt very much like, if this is never stable, then we don't necessarily have to address all of the blatant like workplace bullshit that happens. Actually, when I first started working there, I got hired on full time, and I had like, they kept giving me part-time hours until I had to remind them like, hey, did you remember that you hired me on full time? And they're like, oh, okay. And I worked for full time for maybe like, I was only there 6 months. So maybe I worked for like a few months full time before they switched everybody to part time. And I had like quit my previous full-time job to, like Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 during the day, like, to work at this place, nights, weekends, like, whatever, because I was like that into it after my first intro. And so like, yeah, it was interesting that they could allow that type of dissonance in treating their employees that way, which I feel like speaks to the veneer aspect of the culture.
Right. Alyssa?
I also want to share that, yeah, I saw a lot of instances where people were being instructed on how to be women, where it was like, oh, you're standing in the wrong way, or you're wearing the wrong thing. And that I think is extremely, that's just, no, like that's not empowering. That's not empowerment. There is no model on how to be a woman, right? Or anyone, how to be anyone. And so, yeah, I noticed that a lot. And, I felt that in the way that even the way I dressed was like being shamed, and that it was what's right and what's wrong. And that's not liberation.
There was a lot, I feel like everything at S Factor that was a goal in my experience was always very amorphous. Things would be described as like, well, it's fluid, it's feminine, it's not rigid and masculine, which basically means they can keep changing the definition and moving the goalpost. But I found that in the film, especially, they focused on the one person who basically presents as non-binary, who was in class with their fiance, and how Sheila was forcing that person to present more and more feminine as if that was authentic to her. And it just made me flash back on all the instances I can recall over the year, including a couple with myself personally, of the message coming from Sheila being, I know your body better than you do. I know that you actually want to dress up like a Catholic schoolgirl right now. And so I did it because I was in teacher training and I thought Sheila knew everything. And I was so squicked out by what was on my body that I basically tried to crawl under the couch and just hide. But I saw that constantly almost weaponized against people. I know your body better than you do, so therefore I can keep pushing you toward what I want, which I know is good for you. Even if it's not what you want right now, if you're not brave enough to, or are you brave enough to go there with me? Asked, when someone's on stage in front of 200 people, as if that's legitimate consent.
It's interesting that you chose that phrase, "Are you brave enough?" Because I've noticed that in a lot of her conversation, it's always like, "Oh, you're so brave for showing up here," and I've seen that, and not outside of the movie and in the movie, because full disclosure, I have interviewed Sheila Kelly a few years ago, and I have an interview on camera, and I asked her some difficult questions. One being, do you not allow men in the classroom? And the answer was, anyone is welcome. So it's very interesting that your sibling is not allowed, and like probably other men or other genders exploring this type of movement are not allowed. So I find that interesting. But I also, in our conversation that I have recorded with her, is the bravery of those folks who come. They're so brave to walk in this door. They're so brave. And then I see that on the movie, and I'm just wondering, like, what is there to be brave about? What is it that they're going up against that they need to be brave about? This should be an experience of enjoyment. And I feel like that type of rhetoric puts on like this, like almost like bleeds into whorephobia. Like, you're so brave for trying this thing that has this stigma that's attached to it, but this is how it can be better. And let me show you, like that's sort of the rhetoric that's how it lands for
No,
me.
they're absolutely reinforcing it at the same time that they claim that there's tearing it down. Like, they're just absolutely reinforcing it. And just to piggyback on what Misha and you just said, when I was toward the end, I think this was 2019, there was a day that 3 guys called up and wanted to take class. And by that point, they were at least aware enough to say that, like, it is illegal to say, no, you can't come take class here because you are men. And the company literally was freaking out. What do we do? What do we do? It was like chickens with heads cut off. What do we do? And by that point, I had for a couple of years been taking class at another studio here in LA where I live, that just happened to be co-ed classes, and the teachers were a mix of men and women as well. And so I was like, fuck, I'll teach them. And out of that, I was like, we should offer a class to people who are non-binary, to guys who want to come take class, people, their significant others, their bestie, whatever they want to do. And so I tried to create this class for all genders. And not only did the studio never once promote it, and at the time, like I just joined Instagram. I was like, I can yell at the same 300 people every week, guys, but like, help me out here. So the class basically, for lack of enrollment, was allowed to die. But the culture of the studio was such that when women found out, and this happened also in New York, I talked to their studio director there. When women found out that there was any kind of co-ed class or all gender class, people started screaming about their safe space being invaded. All of a sudden, guys are going to be showing up in my home class. Someone being here at the end of the day on Sunday means that I'm not safe here on Wednesday morning. And I was like, bitch, the mail comes every day. The Arrowhead guy comes once a week. What are you? But it was such, it was just absolute, the culture had been set up in such a way that it was impossible for anybody who was not a cisgendered woman, preferably white, and for sure as fuck with their price point wealthy, was just not going to be comfortable there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So just to close out on, some culture things before we move on, and I don't, just make sure that we did clarify and touch on this. Misha, you had sent in a note about how Sheila Kelly and the S Factor culture and the happenings directly oppose feminine practices, and how those happenings directly oppose tenets of trauma-informed facilitation. Can you touch more on those two topics? Is that really heavy?
I can definitely, I feel like a lot of already what's been said is very much like,
Right.
of course, this is directly opposing the feminism that she so claims to be some sort of like, you know, carrying some torch for. Specifically with trauma-informed facilitation, I recently completed a certification that is about like holding trauma-informed spaces when somatic like and body movement is involved. And I could go on about this, but I do just want to like really, I'm going to keep it to like these 6 like principles, and I'm just going to list them. And I feel like as I list them, it'll become really apparent the ways in which this is absolutely not a trauma-informed place, and a place that in fact is capitalizing on trauma. So this actually comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Like these are their, like, you know, I think that's like a governmental like body, so not perfect, but these are kind of like the 6 principles they list of having like a trauma-informed approach. And the first one is safety, both physical, mental, emotional. The second one is trustworthiness and transparency, which I feel like speaks directly to the fact, like, you know, to the point of like, wow, I was trying to stay there and see if I could move the needle on some things that turns out you know, people had been trying for literally a decade before me. So with the third one is peer support, which I think especially as, at least as an employee, I feel like there was a lot of like invested in keeping us like separated and unorganized and not being able to necessarily speak to each other about our own experiences. The fourth is collaboration and mutuality, which I think, you know, this, you know, the fact that Sheila is like, I know what you need, flies in the face of collaboration and mutuality. It also flies in the face of this next one, which is voice, choice, and agency. And the last one is cultural humility, which I feel like is just a huge, you know, this whole, everything here has spoken, you know, every single one of these has been violated. And I feel like if I had like having, even just comparing to these 6 things, there is no way, even between last year and now, that they were able to implement any of these things, to abide by any of these key principles. And to speak to your point about like it being so brave, I think that also is very contradictory, because if you're coming there to feel safe and to explore your body, to explore whatever, you know, to explore movement, explore femininity, if you are not delving in to people's traumas, then what is there to be brave about? Like, it's exactly what you were saying. Like, if it's not therapy, then what are, you know, like if you are not, you know, if you know, supposedly we're not, you know, digging into people's trauma, which obviously they have been, then what is there to be brave about? So I think that is a really poignant point. Yeah, like
Right.
I'll leave it at that, because I feel like that was like tons
and
there.
and that's all they did in the movie. And so, and for our listeners out there, like I mean, I encourage you to watch the movie / I don't want you to watch the movie so you don't get traumatized. But if you want to understand the context in which we're speaking, you know, watching even probably 20 minutes of it, or read a synopsis or read the posts by Jess and Alyssa and Misha to get an understanding of like, that's all that movie was it was triggering people's trauma. And I think that the point made about Alyssa too is like, Alyssa wasn't going down. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to speak for you, but it didn't come across, or, and I've known you for a little bit now, and I've not seen you be one to exploit your trauma publicly. And it seems like that was another reason why your voice was like not even included, because that wasn't a path for you.
Yeah, I really didn't. I was so confused why we would start every class with this circle that would always lead to tears. And it felt like, since I wasn't crying, I wasn't like, I don't know, I wasn't paid no mind. whoever was crying the most would be the where the attention went. And I think, well, obviously that person needed help to navigate the experience that they found themselves in, but I didn't understand why that was the focus that started every class. And until I understood that trauma was really a major selling point for the company. But at the time, I just couldn't understand why we were doing that, and it was really uncomfortable. And yeah, I wasn't there for that. And I think having had experience in I just had one experience on reality TV about 10 years ago on Project Runway. And I was like, okay, I'm in a place again where I'm in front of cameras, and I'm going to just keep an arm's length here, because until I understand what's going on here, until I really understand the intention, and if I feel safe, I'm not going to share details of my trauma, because one, I don't understand what it has to do with this class, and two, I don't trust, I'm not trusting these people. So in retrospect, when I saw the film and the way that the trauma was created into like this collage, which was appalling, about, women who had spent 6 months in this class, and the only part of their experience that was featured in the documentary was one line about their most traumatic experience of their life. And I was like, thank God I didn't share anything truly, anything. I didn't share anything that could have been used against me in that way, to be on Netflix with the only line spoken being my worst trauma. I was like, wow, I'm really glad I had at least the foresight to not to just be at arm's length.
Alyssa, I have something I would love to read to you. That was an email exchange that I was blind copied on regarding the treatment of trauma in the class. And since I wasn't in the room and you were, if it's okay, I would just love to get your take on whether or not this sounds accurate. So a good friend of mine who was supposed to teach the one of the beginning class, starting as a beginning class for the Netflix project, as the parameters kept getting changed in the ramp up to the class starting, she actually bowed out very shortly before. And one of the things that she emailed was, after reflection, I find myself suspecting that on filming days within these big groups and multiple classes per day, it will be tempting to create, quote, big moments in a retreat style kind of way, i.e. shatterings may come up more regularly than they otherwise might. So I would love to know, Alyssa, if that sounds like what happened to you. And then also the response that she got back from Sheila, I'm quoting directly, leaving out the name of the person who sent me this. I am a certified TRE practitioner as well as an S-Factor teacher. This is some of the work I do. Please take a moment and read up on this trauma release technique. It is quite powerful. Releasing through S movement is also powerful. I hear your fear and respect that this deeper work is not comfortable for you. If you'd like to speak further, let's schedule a call.
Before Alyssa jumps in, could you just for context explain to the audience what shattering means?
Sure. So shattering is an S-Factor term that basically means somebody having they would describe it as an emotional release. I would describe it as an emotional breakdown, where some kind of emotion in the body is activated and theoretically released from the body. It is something I was never comfortable with as a teacher. It's something I did not encourage in my class, but it is definitely something that, especially at the one retreat and the one smaller event that I taught at, that I saw was just basically being put up on stage for the effect of the spectacle of it. It reminded me of being in acting class with irresponsible teachers who would make you cry so the people in the back row would think that she was a genius, and meanwhile you're left on the floor like roadkill.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did seem that we were being poked, like right where it hurt, and if somebody could show with something they said or with their body, a space of vulnerability, it would be like, well, what's that about? You know, tell me more about that. Describe to me what happened to you, you know? And it's like, I understand that that in the body lives trauma, right? So in movement, trauma might be agitated, but that wasn't natural agitation, you know, that was like specific pulling at the pulling at the thing, that part that was the most vulnerable. And so I think every class started with someone crying and, you know, going there to a place where they didn't necessarily feel safe. And then it was like the techniques were supposed to bring you back into a place of something, supposed to help put you together again or something like that. But I just, you know,
Not
it
only
seemed
were
like it
we
was
not,
just
not only were we not trained as teachers, and maybe some of the people that worked more closely with Sheila will claim that they were. I don't know how, because Sheila doesn't have the accreditation that she claims to have, that TRE accreditation. She does not. When the day I was sent that email, I went to Google and looked up what TRE is. It's a tremor therapy that is mostly used for people with severe PTSD, for example, people in the military returning from combat. So not only do I not have any idea how that relates to S Factor, because it was never brought up, but number two, they list everyone who's certified teacher on their website. And at the time, and the last time I checked, which was about a month ago when I was researching for some of this stuff, Sheila was not listed anywhere in North America, not in New York, not in California on that. So that is not true. She may have started that training. She did not complete that training.
That's very disturbing and
Completely disturbing.
Yeah. And to sort of follow up with what Alyssa was saying, it's like, what is the desired outcome of having people expose their deepest traumas to a group of other folks? Like, what is the intended outcome that's been created by this culture? Like, is there a solution to folks releasing their trauma in this way, or is it just simply to like almost get them hooked to come back for more? Like, what is the intention?
If you read the Hollywood Reporter article, it opens with my friend Nadia, who recounts what happened to her in Hawaii at a retreat where she was pushed beyond a point where she felt comfortable. And Sheila claims that she got consent. I would just posit that if someone is up on stage in front of 200 people and they are asked, are you brave enough to keep going with me? That is not affirmative consent. That is peer pressure, in my opinion. But after that retreat, she states in the article, Nadia got home and her husband was so scared for her and honestly for his own safety that he had her involuntarily committed for 3 days. And it's not the only time that happened. After I attended the only retreat that I attended, which was San Diego in February of 2016, based on what I witnessed there, not only did I decide never to staff a retreat again, in hindsight, I should have fucking quit, but I at least drew that boundary. I went to the home of a fellow teacher, a friend who had taught at many retreats, and said to her, based on what I saw this weekend, I can't believe there haven't been psychotic breaks. Like, you guys are pushing people so far. And her response was, there's only been 5.
But there should be none.
There should be none. If it happens
only
once,
5.
If it happens once, it should be, holy fuck, what happened? Let's make sure that never happens again. Not, let's trap a couple people behind NDAs so they can never talk about it. And also cover it up. When I found out what happened to Nadia, that was the day that I started drafting my resignation. That took years after it happened.
Yeah. There's something that you said, I just want to create some clarification and context around it. You said that they're up on a stage in front of 200 people. Was that typical for these retreats, that many people would go?
It depends. The big retreats, the less expensive retreats, which are the ones that cost ballpark $5,000, which does not include hotel and any necessary airfare. It's just the cost of the content.
That's less expensive?
That's the less expensive one.
Got
Oh,
it.
honey, hang on, buckle your seatbelt. Um, so for those, I would say that the one that I went to, there was probably in the ballpark of just under 200 people. Keep in mind that was a lot of people from the Los Angeles and the Orange County studios, which means that airfare was not required because you could drive. It was San Diego, so that was probably a larger attended one. In terms of her super exclusive retreats, she has these things that she liked to call Tredici, which is a mispronunciation of the Italian word for 13. It's Tredici. God damn it. She's putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Those cost upwards from $10,000 to $12,000 to be in an exclusive group of 16, because why not sell 3 more tickets? And then there are the people that paid for this, the retreats or the events that were too secret for me to know about. Something called Fibonacci, which I don't know why everything is an Italian word. She's fucking Irish from Pennsylvania. But those cost, I heard, both $50,000 and $100,000 quoted for a year-long program. Nice work if you can get it.
I mean,
and in terms of what the point was of putting someone up on the stage in front of all those people, it was to emotionally have them, to push them to a point where they would have an emotional shattering, AKA breakdown, and then provide no follow-up support. Even though there was sometimes some in the room, because outside of S Factor, there were 1 or 2 teachers who sometimes went on retreats who independently were licensed therapists.
Misha, is this something you also saw in the classroom?
So interestingly enough, I've actually never been to the retreat. I've only literally heard these horror stories. And I, like Jess mentioned, I was also kind of around both for teacher training, maybe a little bit after teacher training, shadowing, which was, I think, another whole topic. But I was in and around the studio when they were filming a lot. And I also kind of had like people who are close to me who were in the documentary. And at the time, you know, I went through teacher training thinking like, okay, cool. Like I went through all 3 tiers. These are the things I'm going to learn. And then the people who I knew started telling me about practices they were having in these Netflix sessions. First, they said it was like, I don't know, like 20 or 30 people, which at the time, our biggest studio was capped. This is for all teachers. Our biggest studio was capped at 12 to 14 people per class. And so already like being like, oh, like, okay, they're, I guess, tripling that amount specifically for the documentary, but whatever. And then they start talking about these specific things that Jess is talking about, where like they're pushing into people's trauma. I think one person told me that like there was like physical handling like of her face in one of the documentary series classes. And another one told me that they, with very little notice or either very unclear notice, I don't know, they like surprised the participants by having men in the room.
Yeah,
which also was a practice that I had never experienced or even heard of in the time that I was there. And so like, this is kind of when it started snowballing for me, where they're like, oh my gosh, like they are, whatever they do at retreats, I guess that's what they're bringing into this. But also like this, when I was telling my friends to be like, oh, hey, they're having this opportunity, like for people to sign up to be in this class that might be on Netflix, like this is completely different from the experience that I had in class and completely different than the experience that I had described to the people that I had encouraged to sign up,
Yeah. And Alyssa, you were in the documentary, you were in those classes, and I remember that scene in the movie where they're like, surprise, here are some men to help you with your trauma from men that you've experienced in the past. Like, were you present for that particular part?
Thankfully, I was not. There was a point where I just stopped coming to class, and I was just like, I don't want to be here, which was interesting because I was having this psychological thought process of like, initially when we did join, Sheila said, you're gonna want to quit, but stick with it, right? Which I now know as cult speak. but a red flag moment, right? But yeah, I stopped coming and I was really glad because it didn't make any sense. So why or how is this? It's doesn't make any sense, especially thinking like if they're trying so hard to separate it from stripping, then what is this interaction with men supposed to be about? And then they frame it as healing instead of like, I don't know, something else. And then the healing, it doesn't make it, I don't get it.
I
Yeah,
actually talked to a couple people who were in the class who were present when that happened. The only background I have on it is that is something that I saw one time Sheila do in a class I was present for as a student, where Sheila was teaching the teachers for our supposed continuing development. And she brought these 4 guys in, and I don't remember at this time if they were the same people as in the film or if there was any overlap there. I remember being completely freaked out by it. Apparently the people who were in Sheila's inner circle, people she was supposedly training for her master teacher designation. And I say supposedly because the goalpost on that moved so many times that honestly, I couldn't tell you what the program was about or what it entailed other than doing a lot of shit for free for 2 years. But they did that one day at a teacher class that I went to, and the people in this training program, she called them her apprentices. I was like, who are you, fucking Merlin? But anyway, the people who had been in that group seemed less shocked by it than I was. I just completely froze. And then when I saw it in the film, I was like, I can't believe she is doing that to students. I mean, at a certain level, doing something with teachers was slightly less squicky somehow in my mind, probably not. But I was told by people who were in the room, I don't know how they edited that scene to make it look so cathartic and uplifting, but the people in the room were freaked the fuck out. And a lot of them were actually not okay with it, even though it was edited. Again, we'll get into why I call this movie an infomercial, not a documentary, but edited in such a way that it looked like it was a grand success. And that is not how it was interpreted in the space by a lot of people at the time.
Yeah, definitely. I want to get into how the media played into the misrepresentation of what was actually happening and following up with. And when I say the media, I'm speaking specifically right now about Netflix and the Hollywood Reporter, because the Hollywood Reporter didn't do justice what this story needed to be spoken about either. And, you know, Alyssa, we're definitely going to be coming to you about that part. But because we're talking about Netflix, I kind of want to stay on this thread of you know, certain things and stories, and probably even Alyssa yourself, you can speak on this, were edited out or kind of like, because I saw you in the movie, but you were always in the background, you gorgeous thing. I'm like, please, can I see more Alyssa? But like, you know, their Netflix and the director, I believe, had a major influence on how this was all portrayed, with very little concern for how people were getting harmed in the process. And Alyssa, can you share with us like what that, like, do you have any insight or experiences on like how things were kind of moved around based on what the director needed and what Netflix wanted?
I can say that it felt pretty clear from initially who they were focusing on, and the rest of us kind of felt like just, you know, like props, I guess. We weren't getting as much attention. And in a way, it also felt like favoritism. And certain people were just kind of like, just, I mean, myself, I felt kind of like just dismissed. Like I was just there for class, and some people were like getting a one-on-one, like, real coaching experience. It felt like, and some people weren't. Yeah. So I think that, yeah, I think that there was just like people that were getting a lot more airtime and a lot more focus, and the rest of us were not. And it was never like a clear moment where it's not like I ever, we never spoke directly. Actually, we were never even really introduced to the director or the crew. It was kind of just like they were supposed to be flies on the wall, but we never interacted with them in a way to get to for them to understand, you know, who we were or anything like that. Yeah, I think that probably answers.
Yeah.
That was my experience as well with the director. They shot in the studio there over a period of about 6 months, and I think it may have gotten extended a little bit after that on occasions. But I was present teaching and using the same lobby with my students, being there as with the people that were for the Netflix class. And after they were there once a week for about 4 months, the director got around to introducing herself to me. That was my experience with her. It was basically, you're not here for me, therefore you are a non-entity, which was super fun to be around. And as far as, oh my God, I'm just totally blanking. Oh yeah, as far as having an agenda, what they were doing. I know that when the experience was done, several of the women who were teachers for the Netflix class, along with Sheila, who have all since resigned, except for, I think, 2, is off the top of my head. Several of them asked to be removed from the film because they were no longer associated with the company and were deeply unhappy with how the class went down and how it portrayed things versus what typically happened, at least within classes. Some of them their request was honored and they were removed. Some of them, the specific instances that they asked to be removed were taken out, but anything else that they forgot to mention specifically was left in. And there was one teacher who asked to be taken out, and I'm not gonna out her by saying who she is, it's not my story, but they basically said, no, Netflix wants more of fill in the blank in the story, which basically made her sound like an object. And she was furious about that. She asked the director, I think multiple times, to be taken out and was told no. As far as the agenda behind the movie, people who were directly harmed by the racism and the trauma practices at S Factor prior to the filming starting told the director what had happened to them, what their experiences were. And near as I can recall, her response was, I'm not looking for controversy. I hope this doesn't affect my film. To which I reply, as someone who's been an actress for my entire adult life, like, bitch, that is your film. If you are going to pretend like that shit didn't happen, if you're going to put a coda on the end of your movie saying everyone is still teaching and everyone is happy, when in reality 14 teachers quit en masse because Sheila wouldn't take responsibility for the racism shit that went down around Facebook and George Floyd, then that's an infomercial.
Mm-hmm. Misha, what's been your experience?
So, and I think this ties in a lot. This is like a through line through a lot of what's being said. Another thing that I remember since the beginning, another thing that I remember in a lot of intros is, and looking back on it, I don't know the person who gave this feedback, and I begin to question whether or not an actual person said this, but they constantly would reference how people would be like, oh, I quit my gym and my therapist because now I just go to S Factor. That is also something that was used in a lot of intros. I know for sure that it was used when a lot of front desk ambassadors would talk to people who were interested in classes. And so this whole idea that we stay away from therapy, I think somewhere in the article, Sheila's like, we stay far away from that. Like, I've heard that been used like up to my recent experiences.
She said it on Nick Files' podcast. She shit talked therapy on that, and that was after the Hollywood Reporter article came out. She also, in a recent blog post, in one paragraph, managed to shit talk therapy, religion, significant romantic relationships, and friends as being a place that you should turn when you're feeling down. The implication being her movement modality is, of course, superior to all those things. And I'm like, that's what cults do.
Oh yeah, and so it's interesting. I think that they're trying to, you know, especially in the article, it's just is so far removed from what's being demonstrated. Like,
well, when she was interviewed, she had a publicist sitting next to her. When she's on her own, she can't stop telling on herself.
Oh yeah, no, and it's interesting. So I've never had a class with Sheila. I
You
don't think
lucky
I,
cat.
yeah, no, I don't think I've had like maybe one or two in passing conversations with Sheila. And like, I haven't experienced anywhere near a psychotic break, but there have definitely been times where I was in a class, I was with a teacher who, you know, I'm still close friends with, someone with whom I felt safe. We were exploring material that had nothing to do with anything about like ways in which I have been traumatized outside of S Factor. Even so, and even in this movement, there's a very distinct time I remember like like reliving, like being re-traumatized in class without all those things, you know? So this is going back to like, Sheila doesn't need to be in the room. It doesn't need to be some teacher who is Sheila's acolyte. It doesn't even necessarily need to be like, you know, you could, this could be taught by someone you know and trust. And because of the culture, like, and I say this as someone with like a bachelor's in psychology, you know, as much as you can do with that. I had like a re-traumatizing experience in class once. I like couldn't go outside for like 3 straight days. I couldn't be physically touched by my partner who I lived with at the time, you know, and I say this because if this isn't something, you know, like, yes, Sheila's responsible, but it's more than just her. It's the culture, you know. And so, I mean, I walked away from that class thinking like, oh, okay, like I just need to like dance some more, or I just need to like, you know, like there was no teaching in both teacher training. This was after I'd been trained as a teacher. There was no training in which to recognize when should you call in somebody who does like therapy for a living. At what point, you know, what resources do we have on hand to recommend somebody who is very clearly in a lot of like emotional mental distress. That's not part of the culture or the protocol.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, all of that is to say that like, I've never been in a room with Sheila. I've never taken a class with her. I, you know, was, you know, all of the best, like, even in the best of circumstances, being in a, you know, in a class with a teacher you trust, exploring stuff that you are like into, it can still happen. And because of the lack of holding around the fact that like trauma can still come up even if you are moving, like there's no distinction between like, here's, you know, here's when you give somebody resources, which really should be every time, because it's a pole dance studio. You know, and I big air quotes around pole dance studio, but like if your thing is pole dancing, if someone is experiencing mental or emotional distress, you should have resources on hand to handle that. And I, as a teacher, I don't think was given those resources. And I do think that like a lot
They didn't
of,
exist.
yeah,
They didn't
yeah,
exist.
yeah. So just with your knowledge and your depth of time at the place didn't exist. And it wasn't, like, the goal shouldn't be like, oh, just help the student dance it out. Oh, just help the student like collectively breathe with the class. Like it was very much like, just like, you know, handle it however comes up. It was a non-item to even address things like that.
Yeah, it seems it's just it's so interesting how this entire story has played out in that way, where it's just like these important things are left out, and that's just a part of the culture. And then we see this culture get replayed out in mainstream media that's supposed to bring to light what the people behind the scenes are dealing with. I mean, y'all had a mass walkout during the film of staff. Um, and there was tons of speaking out after the film. Cut to the Hollywood Reporter, you know, swoops up this story and thinks that they're gonna like tell the story, and then they leave out strippers, they leave out sex workers, they just leave out of the narrative when the whole origin story of Sheila is I played a stripper on a movie. And so, you know, I kind of want to lead into that, if that's okay. If we don't have any more closing thoughts on what we just spoke on, I'd like to give you an opportunity to do that before we turn into the Hollywood Reporter.
Can I jump in? Just two things
Sure.
Keisha shared made me think of.
Yes.
One was in a class not with Sheila. This was again a teacher class. They would do this for us sometimes. Is like, hey, thanks. Here's a bonus for working here. Like, you can come take class. And usually it would be a teacher volunteering to teach. Every now and then, this woman named Sarah Goodman, who was apparently the first teacher Sheila trained when she opened the studio, and the studio needed more than one teacher. She used to only, by the time I was there, she did not teach regular classes, but she would teach teachers. And not going to say who this was because it's not my story, but I believe I was in the class that this happened in, and it didn't hit me the way it hit this other woman. But in the warm-up, one of the songs in Sarah's playlist was a song by Nirvana with an extremely provocative title. The song is Rape Me. And this other woman in the class, based on her past experiences, had an extreme trauma reaction. And I believe she just left. She definitely froze. It was like things were not okay. And reached out to the head of the teacher department at the time, and that person looped Sarah in, and Sarah's response was, "I guess you're not ready for my class." So to say that it was only Sheila is a flaming load of bullshit. I also have, just speaking about how ill prepared we were to deal with things like Shattering. God, I'm gonna not have any idea where this is. I have a slide somewhere that was from, oh shoot. I have too many things open on my computer. Hang on a sec. I have a thing that was basically a slide at one of the events that stated what we could expect, how to handle shatterings. Oh, there it is. There it is. There it is. So this is a slide that was put up. I believe this was at the beginning of the SK Live event in 2017, which was the only other one of these events that I staffed. How to help someone awaken or shatter safely. Number one, put a hand on their body. If you know anything about people experiencing trauma, you're pretty much not supposed to touch them. Number two, encourage them to breathe deeply throughout the body and into your hand. Number three, notice when they release tension from underneath your hand. And then number four, give them cues to bring them into their body in the present. Feel my hand, listen to the music, bring them into laughter release, stand them up and encourage them to put emotion into movement. Quick dancing on the beat, skipping around the room to the twist, the mashed potato. This will bring them through and around. That's what we were given to work with.
That's disturbing.
Wow. Yeah, I think this will, transitioning over to the Hollywood Reporter, but I think this will tie this up succinctly, and things that I've learned about trauma-informed spaces since deciding to like really dive into building a foundation of trauma-informed like experience since then. Also, again, from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed, one, realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands the potential paths for recovery. Two, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved within the system. Three, responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. Four, seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. And so these are all like things that it's like, oh, a program can be considered trauma informed if they are doing these things. And obviously there's a scale leading, like a spectrum leading up to how someone can be trauma informed. But especially if they knew they were diving into these shatterings enough to have a slide about it in the way that they taught teachers at a retreat, there's no way they can plausibly deny that they aren't like trying to do some sort of self-improvement, that they're anything beyond a pole dance studio, which is what I feel like they were trying to say in the article. But yeah, those like,
no, they left out so much. They left out so much, and the importance of the harm that's being done to so many people. And they did what journalists do: get both sides, get everyone's voice. I get that, but they also left out this very loud narrative that has been contributing to this trauma again and again.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So they not by any standards are they in any way prepared to deal with trauma, which they are very obviously in practice, cultivating, mining, exploiting, like performing and parading around for profit.
Right. And performing and parading around like strippers.
Exactly.
And then leaving them out of the narrative. So, Alyssa, I would love to hear your thoughts on that and your experience with the Hollywood Reporter.
Yeah, so coming into the conversation, I'll say that I was nervous to speak about it because I wasn't out as a stripper at the time and only really with people I was close with. So I never brought it up in class with the cameras around. And but I had been aware enough about myself and witnessing people like you, Anne Marie, who have been outspoken and um, just outspoken and honest about your experiences with stripping. And I aspired to be that, right? So when the film came out, or when I first saw the trailer, I really was like, I need to speak to this and speak to this experience because I realized it wasn't just in my head. There was bigger things going on here that felt wrong, and I wanted to make sure people knew that I wasn't in support of what I had experienced. I didn't want to be associated with the negative impacts of the film. But I quickly realized that it wasn't just, it's part of other realms of media were just as hesitant to include my voice as the film was, and not having been someone who's been experienced in speaking about stripping in other formats, I was, not surprised, but I was like, I was expecting when I spoke with the Hollywood Reporter after they spent 30 to 45 minutes speaking with me about my experiences, and I gave them tons of resources and other, I pointed them towards you. I pointed them towards AMD. I pointed them towards Novocaine. I pointed them towards very outspoken strippers who write and speak about inequality around sex work and sexuality at large all the time. And I had been holding a conversation series with about decolonizing sexual empowerment and demystifying stripping because for me, I was like, okay, this is the direction the conversation has to go in order to go somewhere versus just pointing fingers at what's wrong here, because we all know something's wrong right now. But they included none of it. They included not a single word from me. And I got an email saying, oh, in the end, there wasn't enough word space in the space for your words in the article, essentially. And I was like, well, it's not about the space in the words, it's about the space in your mind that is not willing to be open to this part of the conversation. And I understood that. I had an interesting conversation with a friend who's an editor at a large newspaper, and she told me, heads up, even if the journalist has good intentions, in the end, if it's a white male editor, most likely it's going to be, because a lot of the big publications are owned by white men, but most likely they're not going to be open to this conversation, right? Old white men. I don't know wwho actually, I actually don't know who the editor of the Hollywood Reporter is, so I'm not going to specifically say that, but she just prepped me like, it just opened my eyes and my experience too. Like, people are not necessarily in the mainstream media ready to include the voices of strippers. And it wasn't the only time it happened. I had written an article that was I was told was going to be published in Jezebel, and then I ended up kind of getting ghosted by them. And yeah, so it was just an interesting experience to say the least, and to understand that, yeah, it's not the intention of the mainstream media to include strippers' voices, even if they're saying it loud and articulately.
Right. Yeah. And I'm just finding it very interesting, the parallel here, where it's like this is the culture that's cultivated within the S Factor doors. And then this is the culture that gets duplicated by the mainstream media. And this is the culture in which we reside in. And that, this is whorephobia, this is racism, right? Every door you turn to, there's like sort of this protection of this culture, which I'm sort of like having this aha moment. Like, Sheila Kelly was protecting the culture in which she was born into and maintained that culture. And then the media and everyone around her perpetuated that culture and protected it as well. And in a mainstream media situation, you're not able to share your actual authentic narrative because there's this level of this culture being protected. And so, like, what do we do? How do, and I find it, I'm excited that there was a walkout during the film. Not excited that for the reasons that it happened, but like there was a show of solidarity there. So like, what is sort of this like what do we do, y'all? Like
Well, I think you're doing it right now. I think I think shout out to social media and to entrepreneurs like yourself who created their own space to talk about and have these conversations. Because I think the reality is the more people who speak their truth without those filters, without the middleman of the media, the middleman of Netflix to filter it, the more of us get heard. And then we can create our own spaces where shit like this doesn't happen. And like things get you know, we can actually start to decolonize and we can actually start to get empowered around sexuality versus doing it half-assed and just really feeding back into the patriarchy.
Yeah, I'll say one thing that, I know Misha, we've talked about this. I was really hoping there would actually be a lot more of the people who contributed to the Hollywood Reporter article present for this podcast, but so many people, I mean, I know at least 30 people who were sources for that, either on or off the record, did so much emotional labor, and with very few exceptions, at the most, got one single line quoted in the article, if they were lucky enough to. I know, Alyssa, they completely silenced you, but using myself as an example, I had at least 3 conversations with one of the reporters, one of which lasted for 2.5 hours, and talking about the kind of stuff that would basically wreck me for the rest of the day. And my husband said that those were real fun days. And I got one line quoted in the article. And a friend of mine who briefly worked at the front desk, who I encouraged to reach out to the reporters, talked to one of them for a half an hour, and she also got one line quoted in the article. So I feel like there's all this emotional labor being done around it from lots and lots of different perspectives. People who spoke out on the racism, people who spoke out on the trauma practices, people like yourself who spoke out on the erasure of the goddamn origin of how the company was even allowed to exist. And somehow, whatever the intentions were, and I can't speak to the reporter's intentions, but the idea of spreading the net as wide as they could so that Sheila and the company couldn't say this is just like 1 or 2 disgruntled employees. They quoted as many of us as they could, but they really diluted it by doing that. And my other thoughts about the article are, one, even if the print edition, which probably is not nearly as widely read as the online edition, had a word count limit, pretty sure the internet doesn't. And the second thing is, like, again, I understand you're the Hollywood Reporter, but do we really need giant pictures of Kate Hudson and Eva Longoria? Or could we make those pictures a little smaller and include some other people's words, if not pictures of evidence that teachers were sending you proving that some of the stuff the company was saying was flat out lies?
Right, like evidence,
like
not Eva Longoria.
Shadowing classes, that was voluntary and strictly observation. Really? Because I've got 2 different manuals, one from 2011, one from 2016, that have not only all of my logs that got initialed for each time I shadowed a class at the bottom that says this must be filled out completely as a condition of employment, but then I have the internal pages with lists upon lists upon lists of your duties as a person shadowing.
Same.
So it,
And there was space to talk about how strippers were erased from the film in the article, but just not in a stripper's words, because that was addressed in the article, but just not by any strippers.
I'm so sorry, Alyssa. Like, I didn't even know that you'd talk to them until I had a conversation with you afterwards, because your voice wasn't in it and you were in the fucking room.
Yeah, and It's crazy.
I know, for what it's worth. I'm so sorry.
You don't
Aisha,
have to
do you want
apologize.
step in?
I mean, as far as like, what do we do now? It's interesting because like so much of it has been really exhausting to kind of like continuously recount. And I understand like why so many people were like, I just need to be done with this. And then there's also like another huge part of me that I'm like, you know, I'm not in a place to like make it my life's mission to like tear down S Factor. Like that's not, that's not something to like healthily make your life about. But I remember on a community call, the one that Rhonda hosted, Sheila wasn't there, but somebody from corporate was, and they were asking like, oh, well, what can we do so that like women of color like don't have to keep showing up and like, you know, making these corrections to people and advocating for people and this and this and this. And I straight up told them, I'm like, you should just shut down business. You should just shut the whole thing down. That eliminates the need for Black women, women of color, queer women, like queer people in the community to have to keep showing up and doing this, because you obviously don't seem very invested in actually doing anything about it, you know? And I mean, I didn't tell them that thinking like they were seriously going to take that to heart. Like, of course they're not going to shut down, but they can't say that nobody ever asked and that nobody ever told them. Like, oh, maybe you should just shut down. And I specifically said, I was like, even if you wanted to like pivot or whatever the fuck you're doing with rebranding, that's pretty much the same shit anyway. Like, that could have been a fantastic opportunity to say publicly, we fucked up and here's how we're making amends. And because we are doing it, there aren't excuses for other businesses out there to do the same. They really could have had that opportunity to be like, wow, here's all the ways we fucked up, to make an impactful and transformative like amends. And obviously they're not doing that, and they don't seem to have anything to do that. But no, like I've laid that shit out for them. I was like, publicize your apology, publicize what you're doing, make like actively call for other businesses to do the same.
That
You
would
could do
imply
that.
they actually wanted to make a change, and rather than that they wanted to paper over it somehow and make it go away.
Exactly. Yeah. And even in the times where they said they were shut down, you know, quote unquote, and, you know, processing, quote unquote, there were still licensed teachers who were teaching classes throughout that whole time.
Yep.
There were teachers who either independently or through the studio teaching classes that whole time, you know. And so it was very, I mean, it was very obviously like performative, but like,
and unless they've changed their terms since I was a part of the training department, where some of the people I trained were training to become licensed instructors because they didn't live in a place where there was a physical studio. Not only were licensed teachers teaching S Factor material, but you have to pay a yearly fee to be licensed. So they were paying S Factor to teach those classes.
yeah. And I think another thing I heard is that people who were licensed in that way, they were like told or encouraged, and I'm hearing this from someone who is one of those people, not from corporate directly, but they said like, oh yeah, you know, if you want to start calling it some other name, you know, that under your practice, or like if you want to start integrating, you know, like essentially they were like, oh, if you kind of want to like change up the name of what you're teaching and keep teaching it, then go ahead.
That's a major pivot. They resisted that for years. It was like, don't you dare.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, now that there's all this publicity around them kind of like having all of these like shitty practices for so long, all of a sudden now they're okay with people like changing the name and continuing to teach it. And so that was very much just like, they put so many of their own nails in their own coffin. Like,
Yeah.
And yet Sheila carries on.
Exactly.
She was teaching this past weekend at a Tony Robbins event in Austin, Texas. And she is currently also I think she's about 2 months into a 6-month Saturday course that she's teaching online. And in both of them, she is publicly promising people the same experience from the movie. So she's learned nothing.
Oh yeah. And I think even that association with Tony Robbins, like going way, 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 way back, has been like
noted feminist icon, Tony Robbins.
Yeah, exactly. It's super gross. Super gross.
Well, they're perfect for each other. She is his human shield against being called a misogynist, and he lets her farm rich clients. Allegedly, in my opinion.
Right. And when I asked like what do we do, it wasn't necessarily about S Factor in general. It's just like, I think it's so important to have these conversations and to like call out slash call in like especially mainstream media because they're just as damaging in perpetuating the culture that we experience as sex workers, as people of color, and as all different types of identifying folks, and it's just it's I don't even know what to say about it. It's all kinds of things, but I think that like I can't. I'm so grateful that you're willing to have this conversation because I know this is a very difficult conversation and probably brings up a lot of things for for each of you in different ways, and I'm just um so sorry for the experiences that you had that were harmful, and it's no one should have to deal with those things.
I am really hopeful that in terms of all of these conversations, my perfect world idea is that eventually it gets the kind of attention that um, that is currently on like multi-level marketing companies, because I feel like people that have been speaking out against those have been doing it for years. And just now there was a big, actual documentary on Amazon that got a ton of attention. And so people are really starting to be able to call out their bad experiences with these predatory companies. And so my hope is that for strippers and sex workers, for people that were harmed by S Factor specifically, just for anybody that has, any relationship to this, that we just continue to take advantage of anyone who will give us a platform and speak out against it. And I'm like, Nisha, I'm not going to make this my life's work, but the fact is that I do have the time, and when I have the bandwidth to do it, I'm going to keep speaking out until she stops hurting people. That's my take on it today. Ask me next week, I might feel a little bit differently, but when I have the energy for it, and when I say hurting people, I mean both in terms of the people that are traumatized to this day at events, be they in person or virtual, but also all the people that are gaslit and negged and told that they don't matter and are told, structurally put on the side of the line as dirty or damaged, as a way of elevating the people on the other side of the line. I mean, you're no fucking feminist if you're doing that to a group of women, in my opinion.
I feel really similarly, where it's like, I am so down to do whatever I can to, collaborate with people to, one, leave as big of a big ass paper trail, so that when other people kind of come to these same realizations, there are places and things that they can reference to be like, hey, this shit's still fucked. And here's like, records of how it's been fucked for like, coming on like 2 decades. And the other part of that is creating and bringing attention to alternatives, things where it's like, oh, okay, if you're looking for this thing, here's a better way to get it. Here's a better way to do it that isn't this really fucked up thing over here. I know a lot of, especially after the walkout, a lot of like my own like process has been like, what does it actually mean to hold a trauma-informed space, and part of being trauma-informed is knowing when something is out of your wheelhouse, knowing when the line is like, well, you're not a therapist, and giving people the agency through information, being like, hey, I'm not a therapist, so but here's something I can reference you to. I think even just that separation of like, I mean, at S Factor, there seemed like such an egoic attachment to be able to like fix it to the point where they were creating like things to be fixed in the first place. So I think like, I know that I personally have, since leaving, like gotten training in how to, what a trauma-informed space is, different like other movement modalities that are trauma-informed, just to address like that first level of like, if I want to keep being in movement spaces, how do I make sure I'm not taking any of that toxic shit with me? How do I make sure that I am I'm no longer perpetuating stuff that happened there? And then going on to hopefully create spaces with integrity from there. And to kind of like be like, oh, if you're drawn to this, here's how crappy it is, but here's like alternatives, even if it's not with me, here's alternatives. Like, let's yeah, I mean, it's been a really messy process for my end, but that's kind of where it's at right now.
Alyssa, do you have anything to add? And thank you so much to Misha and Jess so far for that. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I want to mirror that. I'm happy to share my voice on this topic because I'm just very passionate about empowerment and liberation, and it's just been so blatantly clear that this is what it's not. And I know that I have felt it weaponized against me personally, as the same way that it's baked into the culture, experiencing people who have been longtime S Factor students saying fucked up things to me, like, you know, I remember somebody saying in front of a group of other women, oh, I've never seen a stripper move as sexy as I've seen women in S Factor move, you know, knowing that I had just shared with the table that I'm a stripper and getting up and moving like for everyone. And it was just like, this is what happens. This is what you send out into the world when you teach this way. This is what gets perpetuated, and it's very harmful. And I am not about that life, and I'm very passionate about creating alternative spaces and inviting the conversation to be had, and also like just underlining that there is no one way to be a woman or be empowered, and that is the more that we, you know, if anybody is claiming to express that as the guru, as the like leader, right, it's dangerous and it's not safe, and it's a big red flag. So
Yeah.
I'm passionate about that.
Yeah. Is there anything that was left out of this conversation that you think is important to touch on? And then I'll ask a follow-up question. I'd love to hear from each of you, like what you would say to either someone who you've worked with in the past or someone that is taking S Factor now, or in a situation like what advice would you give to anyone in your realm based on these experiences that you've had? And we can start with you, Misha, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's okay to make mistakes, but what's not okay is to keep making them once you know better. And that's what I would say as someone who, you know, if you're teaching S Factor, there's no way that you are not inadvertently putting money in the company's pocket and they're using that money to disenfranchise people. So it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to, you know, it's okay to even have made a mistake for like 12 fucking years. And it's not okay to just keep making it because it's a comfortable place to be. Like, I feel like that can be said a lot today of really any way in which people are just trying to dismantle white supremacy, dismantling capitalism. Like, it's okay to make mistakes as long as you do better once you know better, and continuing to patronize them in any way, continuing to be a student, to be a teacher, to be singing their praises as I used to. Like, it's painful to come away. Yes, I don't want to invalidate that pain. And like, there's no better time than right now to start doing better.
Thank you. So true. Thank you for that. Jess, what about you?
Misha, that was brilliant. And I want to just co-sign everything that you just said. I think just in terms of my own personal my leaving has also been messy. And I think that, I right now I'm just sort of teaching technical pole tricks and choreography because I can't get my body and my brain to go near anything that reminds me of S Factor because I don't know what's toxic and what isn't. And I don't think that there is a separation. That's where I am at right now. So I'm just kind of like, put that over there. I know as a teacher over those many years, I said things that were completely inappropriate and wrong and problematic. And for those things, I'm sorry. And I am trying to do better by speaking out now. But if anybody wants to reach out to me to bring up something that I said to them or in their presence, I am open to that as part of trying to do better. I think anybody who is getting involved now, I would just say as a student, like, please just inform yourself. There are things out there that will give you the other side. If something happens that feels off, listen to that voice in your head. Don't let the louder voice outside your head drown it out. And to people who are still teaching it, yeah, I just say, but she hurts people. Everything that you think is good, ... but she hurts people.
Thank you. Alyssa?
Sheesh, that was a powerful, but she hurts people, damn. Yeah, I think that as consumers, as people, yeah, that we can use our decision, our choices and our money to support people who are in integrity. We have the ability to support sex workers and to go to studios owned by sex workers and not be a part of that, of perpetuating that toxicity and shaming. So yeah, vote with your dollar, right? Who you learn from. I think that's important. And then the other thing I would say, yeah, to mirror what Jess said, is listen to the inner voice and trust that it's like, yeah, trust. But it's hard when you're in a vulnerable state and you're looking for something like healing. It's hard to hear because you want to trust the authority in the space, in quotation marks, But when something feels wrong in your body, listen. Yeah, listen and trust that voice.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you so much. I have so many feelings and chills going in and out of my body through this whole conversation. Is there anything else? Is there anything else at all? Any little thing that we missed or left out that you feel is like necessary to be in this particular piece?
I would just like to say, as we're recording, something that I said before we started, which is thank you to you, Am, for giving us your platform. I'm super grateful. There haven't been a lot of, there wasn't as many opportunities post the movie and article coming out as I think many of us hoped there would be. So I am extremely grateful to you for this opportunity.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I also just want to mirror that same gratitude. I think I also just want to really make it clear that like my own sense of well-being, even like the knowledge that I've had, the opportunity that I've had to reflect on things about this whole situation would not have happened if it weren't for the actions of Black women and women of color at that studio. And yeah, if it's possible, I would just encourage everyone to like, there are other Black women with stories that came out of this. And I would just encourage finding them, seeking out the content, seeking out what they had to say about it. I don't want to like name drop people because I'm not, I haven't checked in with them about that, but,
sure.
But yeah, like I am definitely not the only one. And there were Black women, women of color, femmes of color who were there speaking out. They, got there, tried, gave up, and left before I even got to the studio. So if you can and they're open to it, I would really, really just like love to hear from them as well.
Right. Yes, definitely honoring that. Yeah, because that's so much emotional labor and yes, and you're right. There's so many people that come before us that do this work, and honoring them and following their footsteps is incredible. And so thank you for mentioning that. That's very important. Oh, I'm just so in awe of all of you. Oh, I feel so much like love and gratitude to all of you. Is it weird if we like do someone leads us in a breathing exercise together? Is that weird? That we just breathe together? Alyssa, do you want to do that?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I need it too.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to just close your eyes and take a nice deep inhale, and a nice full exhale. Again, breathing into your body, following your breath down into your body, and letting some sound out as you exhale. And just feeling into your skin as you continue to breathe. Feeling into the place where the air meets your skin. Returning back into your body as you pick up any scents that you inhale. And just bringing your hands to your body and taking a moment to just feel into yourself, what's present, noticing what's been stirred up by this conversation. And feeling the ground beneath your feet or the surface that you're sitting on, how you're held by gravity in this moment. And again, taking a full inhale and a deep exhale. And sweeping your hands across your body. Taking all the time you need to blink your eyes back open.
Thank you so much for that.
My
Thank you,
pleasure.
Alyssa.
Thank you so much for this,
Oh, you're so
for hosting
welcome.
this. Yes, a stripper podcast is such a blessing. Seriously.
Thank you. Are you interested in people finding you on social media? Should we do a closeout of social media handles if anyone wants to reach out to you?
Sure.
Maybe. Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So I'm Alyssa Aparicio, and my Instagram is at sensual_radiance, and my website is pussyempowered.com.
Okay.
I'm Jess Hopper, and probably the easiest place to find me is on Instagram. I'm at Jess Hopper Pull, all one word. Yeah, I don't think I'm using much other social media these days. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm Misha. You can find me on Instagram at Miss_Chief_Misha. So Mischief Misha. Yeah, that's pretty much where I am.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to all of our listeners out there for investing in this time and this story. It's so important to hear all of these stories, and there are so many more out there. And I would love to hear from more of you if you've had experiences after listening to this. I'm open to messages and communication around this particular episode as well. So yeah, thanks everyone. We're going to sign off so we can go do some self-care. Yes. All right, everyone, and see you next week, and see all you lovely humans another time, I hope. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening, everyone. This episode has been a production with Period Podcast Network. Find out more on Instagram at Period Podcast Network. Be sure to follow us on Instagram too at YAS, a Stripper Podcast, and you can find us on Twitter at YAS, a Stripper Pod. Please like, subscribe, and rate YAS, a Stripper Podcast here on YouTube. See you next week.